So the audience will be on mute?
Yes, we're asking folks to go ahead and mute themselves if they're not automatically muted when they come in. And let me see.
Beth, I can take over watching the waiting room.
Oh, okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll count it down.
Welcome, everybody. As you're trickling in, I'm going to ask number one that you just mute yourself if you're not already automatically muted. And if folks want to go ahead and just introduce themselves and tell us where you're viewing from, that would be wonderful, so we get a sense of who's on the call.
In the chat box.
Yes, in the chat box.
Chat box.
That would be perfect. For those of you who I don't have the pleasure of knowing yet, my name is Beth Folsom. I am the program manager at Cambridge Historical Society, and I'm thrilled to be here. We'll do our formal introductions in just a couple minutes when we get folks out of the waiting room. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear where you're coming from, what your name is, for those we can't see, and also if there's anything that you're hoping to get out of this evening's program, a burning question you have, or anything that you're super excited about. Hard to narrow that down, I know, but. Okay, let's take a look. We have Cambridge, Princeton, New Jersey, Brattleboro, Vermont, Arlington, Mass. Oh, Wayland Historical Society. Hello, I'm in Framingham, so I'm right next door. Truro. All right. We are well represented. We're just going to wait another minute or so for more folks to come in, and then we'll do our formal introductions. Thank you all for joining us. Let's see. Okay, well, I know that folks are still going to be coming in. We've got a big group tonight. I'm so excited. But I'm going to go ahead and, for those of you that are just joining us, I'm Beth Folsom, Program Manager at CHS. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and with Dr. Susan Ware. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that the Society sits on the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. So welcome to our virtual history cafe. So we've all been introducing ourselves. Those of you that are just coming on, please go ahead in the chat box and introduce yourself and where you're coming from. And a reminder that you can use the chat box to ask questions or make comments throughout the entire program. And at the end, we'll definitely have time to take some of those questions and pose them to Dr. Ware. So don't be shy. If you're thinking of it, something comes up, just type it in and I'll go back and take a look at them as we go along. I'd like to extend a special thank you and welcome to Society members who have made tonight's event possible. If you want to consider joining us, head over to our website, which is cambridgehistory.org, and click on the support button at the top of the page. And you can also sign up there to receive our e-news so that you don't miss out on any great future events like this one. And a reminder that tonight's event is free, but donations are welcome, and a big thank you to many of you who made a donation tonight. We really appreciate it, and we depend on your support. Also, after tonight's event, as a follow-up tomorrow, you'll be getting a link to a survey asking how you liked it, what you learned, and what we can improve on for next time. So please just take a few moments tomorrow and fill it out. It helps us a lot and helps improve our programming that we're bringing to you. We are thrilled to be joined this evening by Dr. Susan Ware. Dr. Ware is the author of Why They Marched, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote, American Women's History, A Very Short Introduction, and Letter to the World, 7 Women Who Shaped the American Century, among other books. She is honorary women's suffrage centennial historian at the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, Harvard University, and general editor of American National Biography. Her commentary is also featured in The Vote, this year's multi-part PBS American Experience documentary on the suffrage movement, which I hope you've all read and watched and digested all of that amazing information before tonight's program. If not, hop on over to our website, go to your independent bookstore, and go to PBS and look and watch and read. Okay. So, Dr. Ware, thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to be speaking with you. I'll just say up front that we do share this connection that we are both Wellesley alums. You are class of 1972. I am class of 1998. And definitely that had a profound impact in shaping not only my my academic experience, but my career as a historian, as I know it did yours, and that's something we'll touch on in the course of the evening. Just a quick question, a show of hands. I'm wondering if we have any other Wellesley alums on the call this evening. Oh, I see hands. This is wonderful.
Yep.
Okay, thank you all. Okay, so Dr. Ware, I'm going to start by asking you a question that I saw on Twitter recently, and it really kind of sparked my thinking back to my early memories of women's history and learning about women's experience. So this is the question. It was, what book got you hooked on women's history? So is there a particular book that you remember in your early memory saying, hey, this is inspiring me to write about women's experience and maybe how it's different from men's experiences?
Yes, there are 3 books, and I will answer that in a moment. But first, you got the Wellesley women to raise their hands. I see several former students and people I knew at Harvard in the 1970s who are here. So we need to also recognize them. And I'm so tickled that somehow we are connecting in this way. But it might not surprise you that someone who is a writer and an academic would come to a topic through books. And for me, I really became a feminist in 1970 by reading 3 books. I was a sophomore at Wellesley, and the first was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. The second was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And the third was Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook. And I think those 3 books are a pretty good introduction to the powerful ideas of modern feminism. But because I was also interested in history, I wanted to know more about the history. And so at that point, I think I really began to think about combining my newfound feminism with my ongoing love of studying history. And that link has not been broken now in more than 50 years. And what a privilege it has been to be able to have a career that is devoted to learning more and sharing this knowledge about the topics that I really care the most about. So I feel very lucky.
Great. You know, I was thinking about that as I was answering my that question on Twitter. I was thinking about Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's book, A Midwife's Tale, and that to me was, and I didn't read it until graduate school, but that was a light bulb moment for me because it was Ulrich unpacking this what we would consider very mundane diary of this woman who is cooking and cleaning and serving as a midwife and tending to the sick in her little rural Maine community in the early 19th century. And she makes it have substance. She makes it important. She gives it validity by writing about it. And that to me, I think was a real moment where I said, you know what, we've been taught that certain realms of experience that are generally considered male are important historically. And that was a moment to me where I said, this largely interior life, this largely domestic life, these experiences that women are having, they have credence, they have importance, and we need to study them, and we need to see them as just as valid. So that was my personal light bulb moment. But
well, having Laurel as your guide to that moment, because she's such a wonderful researcher and writer. But I think she did bring other people into the field, and there is this combination of both looking at aspects of history that weren't considered important before, but also just wondering, where were the women, period? And there were a lot of those moments when I was starting out, because I knew the women were out there, but where were they? Why weren't they in the history books? Why weren't they getting written about?
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is going back, where did you grow up, and what was your earliest experience like with history and having those kind of holes? Where did you see the holes, and when did they start to get filled in for you? Was it before college?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I think I really, in high school, I was much more interested in reading novels and literature, and I loved the history, but I think that's the direction I thought I was going. Now, it didn't really sink in that I was mainly reading novels by men, about men, but, women who were young girls who were readers managed to stay engaged with what they're reading no matter what. But I think it really took my awakening to the ideas of modern feminism to really show me about the absence of women's voices in the traditional historical narratives. And I must say that happened really not from my classes at Wellesley. I think you and I probably had a very different experience. By the time you were there, Wellesley was a feminist institution. When I was there, it was not. And even though I had a lot of women professors, which I now look back and appreciate, there was no discussion about women's history. Or women's topics, one or two courses, maybe by a visiting professor, but it really was not on the agenda. Wellesley was trying to be, I think, like one of the male colleges, except we happened to all be very bright, talented women there. And yet it also gave me a grounding in how to be a good historian, how to do research, that I then built on when I went off to graduate school. So I want to give it credit, but it's not as if I had my first introduction to women's history in a Wellesley class.
Yeah. That's fascinating, because I was thinking about the time frame that you were there, 68 to 72, and that was such a momentous, period of time. I didn't realize that Wellesley didn't have that real feminist bent at that point in time. No,
not yet.
That's
but
so interesting.
Better late than never.
Yes.
So,
yeah. So how was the shift for you going from Wellesley, or from a women's school, to a co-ed graduate program, and how did you find Harvard in the early 70s? Was that a more sort of, was it more on the cutting edge of women's history, or were you still sort of forging your own your own path?
No, oh God, Harvard was such, perhaps still is, a male institution in the 1970s. And I really have to ask myself why in the world they admitted me to the graduate program in American history when I announced in my application that I wanted to study women's history. And then they were all the professors were so hostile to it. And I later figured out why I was admitted. And here I do have to give Wellesley credit. I was the only woman among the American historians. There were 14 men in my class. And Harvard had a tradition of admitting one woman per year from one of the women's colleges. And I think that my year I must have gotten the slot. But one of the reasons I wanted to go to Harvard was because I had already been introduced to the amazing resources of the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. And so even though I was not getting much support from the Harvard history faculty, I did find two mentors, Frank Friedel and Barbara Miller Solomon, who really did believe in what I was trying to do. And then I had the treasures of the Schlesinger Library to write my seminar papers and to draw on for my teaching, and then to use for my dissertation research, which became my first book. And practically every other book I've done since then has had a tie or a link to the Schlesinger Library. So for me, the Harvard part of it is really the Schlesinger Library part. So it was a challenging time trying to do women's history at Harvard in the 1970s, but I like to think it made me a stronger feminist. And I do hear back from people who knew me back then that I was already pretty good at speaking my mind. So
how was that relationship between you and the 14 male graduate students? Did you feel like they were seeing you as sort of other than, or how did you feel about your cohort?
Oh, they were much more supportive than the male faculty. And I had gone to a co-ed high school. It wasn't new to me. And it was so exciting, the teaching I was doing. I was a TA in one of the first women's history courses taught at Harvard. And we really felt like it was a revolutionary act to be teaching this topic. And it was so exciting. And I look back on those days, and there are a couple of people on this call who were part of that. And it was really, you really felt like you were doing something special. Now, if someone at that point had told me that in my lifetime, a woman would be president of Harvard, and that she would be a historian, and that she would be a friend of mine, I think I would have said, "What are you smoking?" Because I mean, at that point, there was only one woman in the Harvard history department. But there was a way in which it was a very exciting time to be there. And I think that a lot of the foundations were laid for women's history, and then also for the emergence of women's studies, which is now women's gender and sexuality studies at Harvard. And it's part of this tradition that I feel very honored to have been part of in the 1970s.
Wow. So you've touched on my next question, but I wanted to ask more about your relationship with the Schlesinger Library, starting in grad school and of course continuing to today. So what do you feel is the importance of having this library dedicated entirely to the experiences of American women and their history?
Well, it's totally spoiled me. I mean, having it right there in Cambridge, being able to go in and have such amazing resources. And I think that, the Schlesinger Library really is one of the premier, if not the premier, women's repositories of women's history, dating back to the 1940s when it was first founded, with material from the suffrage collection, from suffrage history. And being able to have that archive already there and be able to sample it. A lot of other places, people really had to dig. If you use the example you gave of Laurel Ulrich, she had to go find Martha Ballard's diary, I think in the Maine Historical Society, and basically discover it. It was a little easier for me because I had all these beautifully cataloged and accessible collections that I could draw on. And so, for me, a lot of what I've done as a historian and why I've wanted to maintain my association with the library is just to thank them for getting me started and giving me so much to work with over the years. And my suffrage book, Why They Marched, really is in many ways a love letter to the Schlesinger Library. So many of the sources and the objects were ones that I first saw when I was there doing research as a graduate student. So it's very satisfying for me to be able to publicly say thank you.
Wonderful. My next question is about your work in historical biography. So most of your work has been through the lens of biography and kind of using biography as a tool to unpack many different issues in American history and society. How do you see that as a useful tool or as a vehicle for getting at these broader issues? How do you see the individual life as a lens through which to focus on broader issues?
Well, to me, biography is a way of engaging readers. It's telling stories, and it brings the history down to a personal level. And that is such a good way of drawing people in. It's not the only way, but it's a tool that I have felt very comfortable with my entire career. And I think in some ways that sets me apart from other practitioners of women's history. Not everybody has the kind of biographical bent that I seem to have, and yet I think it has served me well, and it's allowed me to take individual lives and then open them out into areas that I want to write about, often having to do with the history of modern feminism. And it's because that's how I like to tell history, and it's also because I find it's a way of engaging my readers, of really drawing them in.
Can you speak a little bit about the particular subjects that you picked for Why We March or Why They March, and what about them was compelling to you, and how a lot of them kind of differed in their either their approach to suffrage or their location, their race? How did those? What made you want to pick the particular women that you did, and how are they different from many anthologies that went before?
Well, I guess I have to backtrack a little bit to answer that question, which is to say that a while ago, I decided that I really did want to write a book that was going to be timed to the suffrage centennial, which we have finally now gotten through, and it still seems to be going on. And at first I thought I would do some kind of broad sweeping, meta history of this. And I just decided that I would get bored doing that. And I thought, if I'm bored, my readers are going to get bored. And it behooved me to find a way to still tell that general story, but to do it in a way that was more accessible. And so I chose to do it through both short biographies and biographies, or even shorter biographies of objects, so that it was a way that I could really cover all the facets that, as a historian committed to intersectionality and diversity, I knew there were topics that I wanted to touch on that were important to the history. And so then it became this huge juggling act of figuring out who I pick and where, and how I put the story together so that it adds up to a history of the women's suffrage movement, even though you don't quite know it when you're reading it. So I had my internal checklist of, somebody from the West, somebody from, certain areas, and radical and African-American women, and was able to do that. And then when I was choosing my subjects, I really just kept going back again and again to my experiences at the Schlesinger Library. These were women, many of whom I had known before because I had written about them before. But I hadn't written about their suffrage years. And so I was able to already have met them, and then go back and think, okay, now I can tell their stories in a different way. And I'm really tickled and proud of how it worked out, that with my 19 stories and 19 objects, 19 of course for the 19th Amendment, it really does add up to a history of the women's suffrage movement that, from what I'm hearing, does not put people to sleep. And it was certainly so much fun for me to write, so much fun that I wonder, how am I ever going to come up with another topic that's as fun as that one? But I'm working on it. So,
yeah. I'd like to just take a quick pause here to ask another question, because I'm curious about, we subtitled this this program, How Were We Taught About Women's Suffrage? And I'm curious to know how many of you feel like you were taught about the women's suffrage movement in a substantial and meaningful way, either as a high schooler or in college or graduate school. How many of you feel like that was a core part of your historical learning? I will say I was, but you know. I see some thumbs down. Okay. All right. So I think that tells us a great deal.
could I add to that, Beth?
Oh, yes.
One of the things that's been interesting for me as I've been out on the suffrage hustings, as I have been for the last year and a half, is I think I sort of thought that people my age and older would have had no women's history in school. So they really wouldn't know anything about it. But that younger people, and there's quite a lot of people who are younger than I am at this point, that they would have had exposure to it and they would have more familiarity. And yet what I found is across the board, no matter how people were educated or what part of the country they were from or what age they were, people knew very little at all, if anything at all, about the suffrage movement. And it's not that it's not in the textbooks, it is, but it's just not featured in a way. And I mean, there's two ways you can read this. One is, boy, you know, people should be knowing more about women's history as they're in school. On the other hand, I found that once people heard about the women's suffrage movement and heard this history, they were so excited to learn more. And so there's a real audience out there. But in general, most people are starting from pretty much zero, or Susan B. Anthony, but not much deeper than that.
Yeah. And that leads me to my next question, which is, in a sense, the study of the 19th Amendment is a way of looking at women's political and civil achievement through a pretty traditionally male lens, right, of gaining suffrage rights, getting the vote, being politically active in a way that we recognize as being publicly political. And I'm wondering how we reckon with that. How do we are we seeing women and their using a benchmark for their advancement that we're seeing through a male lens? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. And if you could talk a little bit about, because I know that in your book you're arguing that suffrage was about so much more. The experiences that these women gained for themselves as well as for the public good are about so much more than that achievement of the right to cast a ballot, that there's so much more rich experience that they get and solidarity. I'm wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about that, how it goes beyond that one very important but limited act of casting a ballot.
Well, I think one of the great contributions the rise of women's history within the history profession has made is to expand the definition of what is political. And it is so much broader than just casting a vote. And of course, if that were the only measure, then women would have had no political influence at all in the 19th century. And clearly they did. And they were finding other ways of influencing and mobilizing than through the vote. And so I see it as a traditional, in some ways, a traditional benchmark of voting. And yet, when you put it in this wider lens, it's really what we're trying to do with women's history is to make the connections much more broadly than just a struggle for the vote, and thinking about, well, what have women done with the vote? What have women done in their communities? Who's left outside of the vote? All these things that really are a window on a much broader question of what have women done in history? Where have they been? Why don't we know more about them? What should we know? And so, you know, in a lot of ways, I think of the suffrage movement as being just one sort of marker or moment in this much larger story of women's political mobilization, which is ongoing. I mean, we don't need to be told today in 2020 how important the topics of women in politics and women in political mobilization and voting rights are. And the suffrage story is part of that larger continuum in women's history. And I think for me, that's been the largest takeaway point to sort of doing this deep dive I did to write my book, and then talking about it, is just feeling that the suffrage movement really is part of something much larger in terms of women's history, and that I'm part of that. We're all part of that in our own ways, and that it's an ongoing story. It didn't just end in 1920. The suffragists didn't think it ended then. And so we're sort of seeing how it plays out and will continue to play out, and it will play out long after I'm gone. And I'm fine with that. I mean, to me, it makes it seem even more significant and important.
And you spoke about intersectionality, and I'm curious. I know we've got some questions. One of which is about issues of race, and I'm also interested too in the question of the connection between the women's suffrage movement and the labor movement, because I know that especially in terms of tactics and approaches to protesting, there's a lot that these women are gaining from experience in the labor movement, whether it's their own or copying some of the things that laborers are doing. So those are two of the main areas of intersection that I think folks are particularly interested in: race and labor.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've really noticed about this centennial and all of the events that are going on, and I'm sure this has been noticed by many people in the audience, is how central the question of race has been in the discussions, in ways that when the 75th anniversary happened in 1995, and certainly when the 50th happened in 1970, I don't think that it was so central. And to me, this has been one of the most positive and productive aspects of all these events around the centennial, is using it as a chance to both highlight the contributions of African American women to the suffrage movement, and yet also draw attention to the challenges that they faced, main challenge being the often racist assumptions of the white suffrage leadership that was not really willing to share the stage with them. And of course, the other reason why we have to foreground the question of race in the suffrage movement is because in 1920 was at best a hollow victory for African American women. If you were an Ida B. Wells or a Mary Church Terrell and you lived outside of the South, you could vote. But most African Americans in 1920 still lived in the South, where they were unable to vote because of Jim Crow restrictions. And it really was not until the 1965 Voting Rights Act and subsequent iterations of that law that was addressed. And I have been very pleased to see how people are willing to grapple with this issue. I mean, in some ways, it could be very easy just to say, who cares about the women's suffrage movement? It's just a bunch of white elite women, and they were all racist, and, you know, why are we spending any time on them? And to me, that's a very short-sighted view, because it, among other things, it erases the contributions of African American women. And I think what history has to do is to look at these movements and these leaders and these strategies and these decisions and see them warts and all. You know, some of them are ones that are just cringeworthy to us. I'm not sure the suffragists were all that more racist than most other white Americans at the time. But again, I think this has to be part of the story that we're telling or the questions that we're asking. And it very much has been. And I think that that's one of the most positive things that has come out of these centennial conversations that have been going on. And I think will continue to go on now that we're past the actual centennial and they're moving into our second century of women's voting.
Yeah, definitely. So my last question that I had prepared, and I'm going to go ahead and then turn it over to folks who I know have put a lot of questions and comments in the chat.
Sure.
But my last question is, what would you tell your 20-something-year-old self just starting out in this field? What advice do you have for yourself, and what has hindsight told you? I know that in your recent blog post that you had given us at CHS to post, you had said that your view of the Cambridge women who were organizing for women's suffrage changed quite a bit from when you first took on that project, and the way that you saw their privilege and their activism had shifted quite a bit over the course of almost 50 years since you wrote that. And I'm wondering, what advice would you give yourself that you know now about viewing and framing women's history that you didn't know then?
I would say just to keep at it, don't get discouraged. I'm not sure I needed that advice myself because I was having such a good time doing it that I didn't really get discouraged. But I think it is also important to be aware of where you are at a certain moment in time. You know, when I was starting out, I was a young woman, feminism was young. Now I'm a senior scholar, nearing the end of my career, although my career doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. And obviously one has different perspectives at that time. And what's been interesting for me is to be able to use this moment to sort of look back on my younger self and also look back on the changes in the field of women's history, which has changed enormously in the 5 decades or so that I have been part of. And so I think there's always a conversation going on between the new questions that are coming up, previous scholarship, different generations bringing different perspectives to it. And that's what keeps a field dynamic and going forward, and more power to it. I mean, we don't want it to just stay where it was in 1972 or 1982 or 1992. And I'm just in awe of how much still keeps happening in terms of both the scholarship and the activism that I see. And that's what really keeps me excited. And maybe the advice would be just to a young woman, you won't be alone. There will be others out there joining you. And that's really how I feel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and do a few of our questions and see how far we can get, because folks are really excited and engaged. We have a question. Did this book, I'm assuming that means Why They Marched, change any of your conclusions that you drew in your earlier work on Amelia Earhart and feminism, quote unquote, after suffrage, which you have said and is very true, that there is no such thing as really post-suffrage, but after the passage of the 19th Amendment?
I think probably not. But clearly what is at work here is I am drawn as a historian and as a person to the history of feminism. And so I was trying to look at it through the lens of a popular heroine like Amelia Earhart. And then I found myself drawn back to the suffrage movement. And I think in some ways, I make the case that the suffrage movement is part of the larger history of feminism. And not all historians are willing to go quite that far, but I have a fairly capacious definition of feminism, and I see it as part of this larger movement. And so in many ways, I keep using this phrase continuum, but I think that there is a continuum from the suffrage movement to a post-suffrage period that then allows Amelia Earhart to become the wonderful popular heroine and role model for women. It's a different era, but that's what's so fun about studying history. It never stays the same.
Absolutely. We have another question. Can you talk about the split among the suffragists, the Alice Paul, more radical arm, and the other arm?
Well, I think this is maybe one thing that I've come to a better appreciation of in terms of social movements, which is having splits is not necessarily such a bad thing. And the suffrage movement has two major splits. One happens right after the Civil War over the Reconstruction Amendments and whether African American men should be enfranchised before white women. And the second is over tactics in the last decade of the movement, whether to go for a federal amendment or go more by a state-by-state approach. And I think especially in the split in the 1910s, it really helped rather than hampered the suffrage movement moving forward to its final victory. You had the traditional mainstream work within the system, doing the lobbying, writing the letters, buttonholing members of Congress. That's really important. Then you also had Alice Paul and her militants who were out there picketing the White House and going to jail and going on hunger strikes. And each side could point to the other and say, oh, we're not like them. But I think that they were both helpful, very instrumental in making suffrage a topic that nobody could ignore. And that was one of the things that really pushed it forward. I must admit that as I have gotten older, I have a little more sympathy for the work within the system mainstream suffragists like Carrie Chapman Catt. She was doing good work. I mean, I still admire what Alice Paul was doing, but that is one way I think where one's age does slightly tinge one's allegiances.
Yeah. Something I'll just, going off of that, I'll just add in that something that I've seen in this centennial season of celebration, I've seen brought up that I haven't really noticed too much before in discussions of the suffrage movement, was the anti-suffrage movement, particularly among women who were opposed to suffrage. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, and if you believe it's important for us to consider those women alongside their compatriots who were fighting on the other side, and if so, why? What does that tell us?
Absolutely. I mean, if the movement, women's suffrage, didn't have such opposition, it wouldn't have taken so long to finally get passed. And one of the most potent places where politicians could say, well, why should we give women the vote, is when they could say, there are women who themselves do not want the vote. And so that was a very important factor. And it was one of the things that I knew was that I had to include it in my book of suffrage portraits, because you can't tell the story of the suffrage movement without telling the story of the anti-suffrage movement. The other reason why I think it is so important to understanding 20th century history is to remind us that conservative women have a history as well. And there are lots of parallels between the suffrage movement and the ERA. But, you know, think of Phyllis Schlafly and her anti-ERA as being the anti-suffragist of her time. And sometimes I joke, it's just as well that the anti-suffrage movement didn't have someone as politically savvy and charismatic as Phyllis Schlafly, or we might never have gotten the vote. But I think it really is important for history and for women's history to remind ourselves that not all women agree. There's no such thing as a women's bloc. Women, we certainly have seen that in our contemporary politics. And I think that one reason why it's important to have it part of the suffrage story is then to see where that conservative strand of women plays out. And it often is characterized by a more traditional allegiance to gender roles, not really wanting to get rid of women's traditional gender roles, but wanting to make sure that they were protected. So again, I think that's yet another way in which the suffrage movement is very much in conversation with political movements that have been unfolding in terms of conservative women since the 1950s and 60s and are still very much ongoing now.
Definitely. Our next question is, can you tell us how Wellesley and Radcliffe students participated in the suffrage movement? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, we think of college students as being, the radicals out there on the barricades and whatever. The colleges at the time were not necessarily hotbeds of suffrage activism. They had their suffrage groups, but they were pretty small. One of the women in my book is Maud Wood Park, class of 1898 at Radcliffe. And she was one of only 2 suffrage supporters in her entire Radcliffe class. So, there are women in college who do support suffrage, but I think very often it's once they got out into the world and began to see that there were barriers against women, both political and social and economic, that perhaps raised their feminist consciousness.
Yeah. And that brings up an interesting idea about socioeconomic status and class, right? Which can kind of be a double-edged sword, because if you have women that are able to go to college, they clearly have a family background that is wealthy enough to send them. And you would think that perhaps that would make their gender roles or their desire to adhere to traditional gender roles a little bit stronger, because they have an idea of womanhood coming out of the cult of domesticity in the Victorian era, right, which is much more I think appreciative of women and much more sort of putting them on a pedestal or in a bubble, whereas working class women are down and dirty, having to get out there and work and scrub floors and do all of these things that maybe that women's work is not quite so desirable to be protected, right, that sphere. But at the same time, women in the upper classes had the money, had the leisure time, didn't have to work, and were able to be involved in the suffrage movement, right? And so can you speak a little bit to how those class lines may have played out?
Well, I think the suffrage movement will take all comers. It needs all the help it can get. I think one of the things that's very important about the activism of working class suffragists is that, and there's a parallel to African American suffragists, is they did not have the luxury of seeing everything through the single lens of gender or sex. They knew that, they were, you said, down and dirty, and they were working on the shop floors and their factories were burning down around them. That was not just because of their sex, it was also because of their class. And so they had a wider perspective that in many ways I think is closer to the intersectional perspective that modern feminism brings, where we realize that it's not just sex and gender, that all of these oppressions are interacting with each other. And I think that that's a prime reason for kind of widening our lens when we're thinking about who suffragists were. We don't want to not give credit to the upper middle class and upper class women who supplied the money and a lot of times the volunteer efforts, because they had the means to do that. We don't want to erase them from the history. And yet I think it always serves us well to widen our lens and see who else was involved.
Our next question, any thoughts on why the 1915 state referendum on women's suffrage was defeated in Cambridge by 2-1? And this is from Patty Nolan. She says she learned that on the Historical Society article by you.
Yes. Hi, Patty. One of the things that I've really developed an appreciation for doing suffrage history is geography. And by that, I mean just looking at maps of the United States and seeing when women got the vote in various parts of the country. And very often they're color-coded or they're cross-hatched in different ways. All of the early successes happened in the West. Some of the longest holding bastions of anti-suffrage were in the industrial Northeast, including Massachusetts. And it was not just Cambridge that went 2-1 against the suffrage amendment in 1915, and the whole state did. And that was very much in keeping with a conservative political orientation of the state that was not didn't have the kind of openness to suffrage. And if you look again at a map, it's almost as if the suffrage victories from the West are marching across the country, sort of pulling with them, finally getting to the East. And there it's really New York State in 1917, which has a breakthrough referendum where in a state with very strong political machines and also a large immigrant vote, they still narrowly support women's suffrage. And that was a huge shift, and it really made it seem more likely that suffrage would finally happen. Massachusetts did, I can't remember, they managed to ratify the 19th Amendment pretty early on in the rollout after it passed Tennessee in August. So it's, it turns around. And I think also one thing that's clearly happening is once it becomes more likely that suffrage is going to pass, politicians, the men, begin to think, do we really want to be on the wrong side of this? Because these women might vote us out of office. So maybe we ought to give this another look. So again, it's this complicated back and forth. But what it really comes down to is the thing that was so hard about suffrage, which is women had to convince men, male politicians and male voters, to share the vote with them. And that was hard.
Next question says, as someone of your generation who regrets never asking her grandmothers about the suffrage movement, I'm curious if there were suffrage stories in your family or conversations you had with those who participated or were aware of the movement in the 1910 to 1920 period.
I wish I had had those conversations. I'm not sure they were there to be had. I also wonder if, was my mother thinking of Susan B. Anthony when she named me Susan when I was born in 1950? I have a feeling not. But I think another thing that's been fun for me in the centennial is that it's encouraging lots of people to ask those kinds of questions, to try and find out when their grandmothers and great-grandmothers would have been able to vote, to see if there are records that perhaps could then be given to local historical societies or state historical societies so that we get a sense of what it was like in individual families. And I have heard of people who are uncovering all kinds of stories. It's not necessarily women who turn out to be card-carrying suffragists, but I hear from people who say, I was thinking about my grandmother, and she was the first in her family to go to college. And then she was a school teacher out west. And she was pretty independent. And they're making those connections between the expanding opportunities for women and their options with this larger story of suffrage. And to me, that's really exciting. And I hope that there are many more of those conversations. And if people end up finding treasure troves of suffrage material and you don't know what to do with them, just find me and I'll help you make sure that they get to the repository. But again, I think it's just the sense of feeling when you trace the history back through the women in your family that you're part of something larger, and thinking, well, when could my grandmother first vote? And I wonder what it was. I wonder what it felt like to her. And even if you can't ask her that, just being able to pose that question brings the history home, I think.
Circling back to when you were discussing your book and the use of objects and discussion of objects, our next question says, what are some of your favorite historical objects and ones that may have influenced your work?
Well, I think, it's hard, like if people ask me who's my favorite suffragist or who's my favorite, what's my favorite object.
Who's your favorite child, right?
Yeah.
It's like the same thing.
But again, I think what I was trying to do was to find things, objects that ordinary people would have had. One example is the wonderful Suffrage Bluebird, which you actually used in your logo for this. And these were like 12-inch tall tin bluebirds that were passed out in before the 1915 election. And when I see a bluebird, I try to imagine a woman deciding, okay, do I put this on my porch? Do I put it in my window? Am I brave enough to do that? Or a suffrage pin. It's something that she would wear and go out in public. And she is publicly stating that she is a suffragist. And in many ways, she's inviting conversations with people about why she's wearing that. So a lot of times it's a way of personalizing it, of making it be, and I use this phrase a lot from Tim O'Brien's book about Vietnam, the things they carried. And I do think that objects are often just as evocative in making a movement come alive as the memoirs and documents and whatever. And most of the objects are ones that I have been able to hold in my hands at the Schlesinger Library. A suffrage pin or a sash, or to see a poster or a suffrage plaque. And there is something just so magical about it, because you think, well, who else has held these or worn this sash, and what kind of story does it tell? But it was hard narrowing my choices because I had so many that I could have used. But that was actually one of the most fun things of doing the book, was making those choices.
I've noticed too, in just looking through some of the materials, particularly from the Library of Congress on the centennial, there was a tremendous amount of sheet music. And that was something really interesting to me, because I had, even though I knew that music has always been a really important part of protest movements or different campaigns, in my mind, I go back to the folk music of the 1950s and 60s as being some of the original kind of protest music. But I was fascinated to see how much is out there about the suffrage movement, how many songs were written, and with beautiful, very intricate covers, and sometimes provocative images on the covers. And that was super interesting to see as well.
Well, I'm laughing because in my early days of teaching, if you wanted to use music, there was no internet, there were hardly even tape recorders. I had a record which I had bought somewhere, and it was called Songs of the Suffragettes. And in some of my classes, I would bring in a record player and play it, and then I would hand out the words. And that would be a way of engaging the arguments for suffrage. I still actually have that record, and it's now an antique treasure. But I think it's a way of bringing the story down to ways that people can relate to. Most of the music was pretty unmemorable, I must say. A lot of variations on Battle Hymn of the Republic and old Protestant hymns. But, the suffragists would try anything. I mean, they were just trying to get their message out, and music was part of it.
And I think there's something to be said, right, for appropriating and repurposing things that are familiar, tunes or other things, and really recasting them to serve the purpose of your movement.
Indeed.
Well, I want to make sure that we're very cognizant of the time. It is now 7 o'clock, although I know we have much more that we would all love to discuss. But I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ware, for being here and for being so open and discussing not only your work, but your life and your career journey. I want to thank everybody who's participated, everyone on the call. Thank you all so much for being here. We've got a lot of great comments in the chat that I didn't get to vocalize, but I hope you all were reading what each other had written, particularly about family histories and ways of finding out about your suffrage ancestors and all of that. And thank you all so much. Again, tomorrow, please look for and fill out the survey. We want to make sure that we're bringing you an even better program every time we come to you. So please help us to do that. And thank you again to everyone who participated.
Yes.
And thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. It was wonderful to see you all.
Bye-bye.
So many old friends.